All right. I think that one of the most important questions that we contend with in our lives is that of purpose. Would you agree with me? Is there a purpose to my life? What is that purpose? Is there a calling on my life? What is a calling? Is there a calling on my life? What is that calling? What am I supposed to do with it? And if I say yes to that calling, or if I go after that calling, what happens if I mess up? Is there a way to fix it? Can I come back on track again if I really make a mess of things? And as we start the message today, I want you to ponder this question, that if God called you by your name right now, what would you say to him? How would you respond to God? And so as Jeff said, we are starting this new summer series, Heroes of the Faith. So it begs the question, what is a hero? Everybody likes a hero, yeah? A hero is someone who combats adversity through ingenuity, courage, or strength, according to one definition. And another said, a person who is admired for having done something very brave or having achieved something great, according to another definition. And there are probably many ways we can look at people who are heroic. Think that maybe this person has inspired us or done something that we wouldn't have done, perhaps. But since we are discussing about heroes of the faith, we want to have a more faith-based definition. So I think we can say that perhaps it's a person who exercises faith in impossible situations. And maybe you know that in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, or the letter to Hebrews, there is a listing of biblical men and women who were considered heroes of the faith. It's called the Hall of Faith, chapter 11 in Hebrews. And so, in this series, this summer, we're going to explore some of those people. And there are some unlikely people in Hebrews 11 that you wouldn't think of as that person here. But they're there. And then we'll also perhaps look into some people who are not in the Hall of Faith, but that we might consider to have done something heroic in terms of the faith. And as you understand from the scripture reading today, we're going to look at Moses. And he is perhaps, he's definitely one of the most famous people in the Bible. You know, he's the hero that went to Pharaoh, so let my people go on behalf of God. Oh, it sounds like a really cool thing to get to do, but I'm sure he was kind of scared to do it. Let my people go. And he was the one who led the Israelites through the Red Sea. You know, he knocked on the rock so the water flowed out. He got to meet God on the mountain and received the 10 Commandments twice, no less. So he surely was a hero of the faith. But was it these things that made him a hero? Or was it other things in his life? So we're going to take a look again at the story. We've heard about the oppression. And we all know the story about the birth of Moses. He was put in a basket, saved, and instead of being drowned, he grew up in the house of Pharaoh. And then we heard about the attempt of Moses to save his own people, to be a hero in his own strength, and that didn't work out particularly well. And And fearing for his life, he then escapes from Egypt and goes undercover. So now we come to the turning point in the story, and we go into Exodus 3, verse 1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, just stop for a minute and consider where Moses is in his life right now. So at the age of 40, he was at the prime of his life, you could say. He had status. He was a prince in Egypt. He had received the best training that money could buy. He was part of the elites of the most powerful and advanced nations of the world. And now, where is he? This is now 40 years later. He spent 40 years in the desert, shepherding livestock, sheep, goats. And I'm pretty sure as a fugitive, he was probably looking over his shoulder maybe every day, because Egypt had powerful long arms, and so he could never be certain that somebody was not looking to take his life. So at this point, 80 years old, no longer a young man by any stretch of the imagination, and he has become the antithesis to what he was. He was a prince, and see now here is this shepherd, and shepherds were the least of the people of Egypt. The Egyptians actually thought they were an abomination, it says in Genesis. They wouldn't sit at the table with the shepherd. They considered them unclean. Anyone who held sheep and goats were unclean, and the shepherds were the worst. So Moses had everything, you could say, and by this one mistake he lost everything, you would say. Now, so the text doesn't really tell us the state of mind of Moses, and we don't want to impose too much on the text, but I think we can deduce that he probably didn't feel like his life had been a success story. He was a prince, and now he's a shepherd. I think it's hard for us to imagine that he felt like, I achieved so much great things in my life. And so here he is in the wilderness, which also just emphasizes where Moses must be feeling right now, because the wilderness or the desert location is often used as a symbol in the Old Testament. It's a symbol of what is the antithesis to God, really. Because God creates gardens. God planted a garden in the land of Eden, and he filled it with what? With plants, colourful flowers, and fruit, and water, and life. And Moses is now in desert, where it's desolate and empty. I imagine that's basically exactly what Moses feels like. Empty. Has anyone ever felt like they've been in a desert? Anyone feel like that right now, perhaps? And if you do, then hang in there, because as you know, this is a story of hope. Moses, for Israel, and for all of us. Because in these most unlikely of places, something remarkable happens. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And maybe you know this scene well, the burning bush, but did you know that there's an angel in the story? Because I've read this narrative many times, and it's not always you actually notice that but it's not actually an angel, it's the angel of the Lord. And this mysterious figure is called Malach Yahweh in the Hebrew, and he appears several places in the Old Testament. And I don't know if you knew this, but his identity has been debated for millennia by scholars, and the ancient church considered him to be the Logos, Christ, before he was incarnated, before he was born in the flesh. So that was very interesting to me when I read this. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. So it's not the fact that Moses sees a bush burning that takes his attention. Maybe that's a frequent thing to see in the desert, but maybe it's not completely unlikely either. Bush might be burning, but they burn up. So Moses is on his way. He's walking, maybe his flock is somewhere around him, and he has his sight set in one direction. And you might think that the Lord would appear to him right in front of him, in the direction that he's heading. But if you look at the text, he's not. God does not appear right in front of him. Instead, God appears somewhere to the side. And so Moses, noticing this, he decides that I need to look at this marvelous sight. I need to change the direction that I'm heading in. I need to change my direction, and I need to go in a different direction towards this miraculous thing. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. You see, God responded to Moses, but not until Moses had changed his direction. Moses took a step of faith. He changed the course he was on, and then God calls him by name, because he knows his name. Twice, to emphasize the urgency of the calling. This echoes, if you read the other stories of Abraham, Jacob, or the young Samuel. Jesus calls them, God calls them by name twice. And what is the response of Moses? Here I am. He says, Hineni. Hineni. Hineni is the Hebrew word that literally means, behold me, look at me. The Enhanced Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew and English Lexicon, it's a mouthful, remarks that this use of Hineni is especially in response to a call indicating the readiness of the person addressed to listen or obey. So finally, Moses is ready to listen and obey. He finds himself, I think, at the end of himself, at the end of the world, at least his world, here far out in the wilderness, and now he's ready to listen. And he responds like Abraham did when he was called to sacrifice his son Isaac. Hineni. He responds like Jacob did when God tells him to take his family and move from the promised land to the land of Egypt where they were detested because of the famine. And Jacob responds in any. He responds like Samuel did when God called him to prophetic ministry when he was just a boy. Samuel said, "Hineni, here I am." So far, so good. So Moses is ready to listen and to obey. But then God reveals what he's actually calling him to do. And then he comes face to face with something called reality. And that's not always so fun. So it says, "Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh," in verse 10, "so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." And this is where Moses, when he realizes the gravity of the calling that God has for him, he starts objecting. He has issues with God's plan. And he has not just one objection, he has 5 objections. And the first one is, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" Who am I? Anybody felt like that? That's very often our response to things. Who am I? I'm just a nobody, says Moses. And actually, I find God's response here both powerful and amusing at the same time, because God doesn't even try to change Moses' view of himself, that he's a nobody. He just ignores that side of it, because that's basically true. I mean, Moses is a nobody, and so are the rest of us, you know. But the point is that God responds, "Certainly, I will be with you." Sometimes you can say more by saying less. God is saying, don't focus on who you are or who you are not. Focus on me. Be assured that I will be with you. I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. It is I who will be with you. And so the highest calling we have is as sons and daughters of the living God. And there is no greater title, there is no greater honor, and there's no greater glory in the world. Amen. But Moses had more objections. What shall I say to them? What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? I'm not really gifted. Why can't you send someone else? Do you think that God has called you to something difficult? I can't tell you exactly what God has called you to do in your life. But I can guarantee you this: when God calls you, He will call you to something that you are unprepared for. Completely so. Why? I think that it's because when you respond to His calling, you will see and you will know that He was the one who provided for you, financially, emotionally, spiritually. He was the one who did it. He was the one who strengthened you when you were weak. He was the one that convicted you of sin when you fell, so that you could repent, because he loves you. He disciplines those he loves. And so that you know that he is the one that encouraged you when you were discouraged. And that is so that you will rightfully give him the glory when you see all the miracles he's done in your life. Now maybe you've responded to God's calling and you've overcome these objections, but then somewhere down the line everything goes bad. Maybe you fell, or whatever you did, you thought you did what God had called you to do, and you made it worse. That happened with Moses. Remember the structure I showed you? When Moses came back to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go," what happened? Pharaoh gave the people even worse oppression. So now even the Israelites hated Moses. What do you do at that point? Why did you call me to this, God? Moses' fifth objection was, why did you ever send me? If you are there, then just remember that God has yet to part the sea, or let water flow from the rock, let food rain from heaven. And something that struck me when I was studying this text is that why did God call Moses this point? After 40 years of shepherding sheep in the desert, you might think that why didn't he call Moses when he was a prince? When he had a title, he had status, he had a voice, he had influence. Why didn't God call him when he was a somebody? And he calls him now when he's a nobody. Well, do you think that these 40 years were wasted years? Or do you think that by shepherding sheep, he learned something about taking care of a flock, helping them to trust him, protecting his flock, understanding how the flock moves, what is important for them, how to lead them to fresh food and water? And do you think that at any point helped him for the next 40 years when he would be shepherding people in the desert? You see, we often think that we might be in the wrong place, or we might not be ready for the calling, but God calls us when it's the right time. I do believe that. And the great consolation in the story of Moses is that God is a redeemer. He calls Moses when he's come to the end of himself, and quite literally to the end of the world. And so if that's where you are now, you can know that he's just waiting to appear to you. But maybe he won't appear right in your path. Maybe you need to look for him. God knows where you are at in your life. He takes notice. He hears the cries of your heart, like he did with the Israelite people. And he calls by name those who respond to him, those who take that first step of faith. So you might need to go out of your way to seek him out. And you need to realize that God has called you for a purpose. When we think about purpose, we often think of individual purpose. And God has that for us, but that purpose, as it did with Moses, the redemption of Moses was not just for Moses himself. God had a much higher purpose and plan for Moses. He did it for the greater purpose of redeeming and calling the whole people of God. And so when God calls you and redeems you, it's not just for you, even though that's great, but the purpose is for the redemption and the calling of all the lost peoples of the earth. And you have a part to play in that. Now, isn't that a noble and high purpose?
Yes, sure.
And we should really want that and seek that, run after that. But perhaps you also object like Moses did. I fully understand. Maybe he's calling you to something very difficult. You know, I'm actually convinced that he does call you to something very difficult. And that's why he's called you to do it. And you're the only one who can do that. And so I hope the response you give is like that for Abraham and Jacob and Samuel and Moses. And I hope that you respond like Isaiah did when he heard God in a mission saying, "Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Hineni, Hineni, here I am, send me, send me."